You think Vikings just hacked their captured enemies to pieces with axes and called it a day? That they were mindless barbarians who knew only one way to deal with prisoners: swift, brutal execution, followed by maybe some ritual mutilation if they were feeling particularly savage. Wrong. The reality of what Vikings did to their captured enemies was far more complex, calculated, and frankly, more terrifying than Hollywood's blood-soaked fantasies. These weren't wild berserkers drunk on mead and violence. They were strategic thinkers who turned prisoner management into an art form that served multiple purposes: psychological warfare, economic gain, religious obligation, and social control. Yeah, you heard that right. While medieval Europe was still figuring out basic ransom systems, Vikings had developed a sophisticated network of human trafficking, slave trading, ritualistic sacrifice, and psychological manipulation that spanned from Greenland to Constantinople. They didn't just kill enemies, they weaponized them. It's like discovering that what you thought was a simple sledgehammer was actually a Swiss Army knife with 20 different tools, each designed for a specific type of destruction. The archaeological evidence from sites like Repton in England, where the Great Heathen Army wintered, reveals mass graves containing hundreds of bodies, but not all of them show signs of battle wounds. Many show evidence of systematic execution, ritual preparation, and something far more chilling: careful selection based on age, gender, and apparent social status. But here's the twist that'll make your skin crawl. The most valuable prisoners weren't the ones they killed quickly. Ships back then were basically floating prisons when Vikings needed them to be. A single longship could hold 30 to 60 warriors, but when packed with captives, these vessels became nightmarish cargo holds transporting human misery across the North Sea. The Viking Age, spanning roughly from 793 to 1066 CE, coincided with a period when human slavery was the backbone of Northern European economics. While Christian kingdoms publicly frowned upon enslaving fellow Christians, Vikings operated under no such restrictions. Their pantheon actually encouraged the taking of thralls, the Old Norse word for slaves, as both a religious duty and an economic necessity. Consider the raid on the monastery at Rathlin Island in 795 CE. The annals don't just mention the typical Great Slaughter. They specifically note that the Vikings took away a great number of prisoners. This wasn't coincidental. Monks, with their literacy and administrative skills, were incredibly valuable commodities in a world where reading and writing were rare talents. Bad choice if you were hoping for a quick death. The Annals of Ulster, chronicling Viking activities in Ireland, reveal a pattern that modern historians initially missed. For every raid that mentions Great Slaughter, there are 3 that specifically mention captive taking. The ratio wasn't coincidental, it was calculated. Dead enemies provide momentary satisfaction and maybe some loot. Living enemies, they're renewable resources. Archaeological evidence from the famous warrior burial at Repton shows something unsettling. Among the 264 bodies discovered, forensic analysis revealed that many weren't killed in battle. They show signs of ritualistic execution, precise cuts to specific bones, evidence of hanging, and positioning that suggests ceremonial arrangement. But here's what makes it even more disturbing. The age distribution doesn't match a typical battle. Too many young adults of prime working age, too few elderly or very young victims. The sagas themselves, when read carefully, reveal this calculated approach. In Egil's saga, we don't just hear about Egil's berserker fury. We get detailed accounts of how captives were sorted, valued, and distributed. Warriors got first pick of weapons and armor. Jarls claimed rights to nobles and clergy. Common raiders divided up the artisans, farmers, and anyone else who could work. The saga of Eric the Red provides an even more chilling glimpse into this system. When Eric's men raided settlements in what would become Canada, they didn't just grab whoever they could catch. They conducted what can only be described as human resource audits, identifying individuals with specific skills: metalworkers, weavers, farmers familiar with certain crops, even storytellers who knew valuable oral traditions. This wasn't random violence. This was systematic human harvesting on an industrial scale, centuries before the term industrial even existed. But here's where Vikings got creative with their first major challenge. Not all prisoners were worth the same effort to keep alive. The problem was immediate and brutal. You've just raided a monastery, a village, or ambushed a rival Jarl's warband. You've got dozens of captives, limited food, limited ship space, and a journey that could last weeks. Every mouth you feed is food taken from your own warriors. Every prisoner you guard is a warrior who can't row or fight if you encounter resistance. The desperate first attempts were exactly what you'd expect from raiders still learning the prisoner trade. Early Viking raids show evidence of what archaeologists call proximity execution, simply killing captives when they became inconvenient. Mass graves near early raiding sites contain bodies showing signs of hasty execution. Single axe blows to the back of the head, bodies thrown into pits without ceremony. But smart Jarls quickly realized they were literally throwing away fortunes. The breakthrough discovery came through trial, error, and cold calculation. Vikings developed what modern historians call the tiered captive system. Think of it as a brutal form of human resource management. Tier 1. Immediate execution for the wounded, elderly, or anyone who would slow down retreat. These weren't murders, they were business decisions. The sagas describe this clinically. Those who could not walk were given to Odin. Quick, efficient, no wasted resources. Tier 2. Temporary slaves for the journey home. Healthy adults who could row, carry supplies, or perform basic labor during the return voyage. These captives had immediate utility, but weren't necessarily long-term investments. Many would be sold at the first convenient slave market. Tier 3. High-value prisoners. Nobles who could be ransomed, skilled artisans, young, healthy individuals perfect for long-term slavery, and anyone with specialized knowledge. These prisoners received better food, medical attention if wounded, and careful protection. Tier 4. Special cases. These were the prisoners destined for religious sacrifice, political statements, or psychological warfare. Chiefs who needed to be made examples of, priests whose deaths would demoralize entire regions, or captives whose public execution would send specific messages to enemies. And the weird part is, this system bears an uncomfortable resemblance to modern corporate restructuring. The same cold calculation of human value based on utility and cost-benefit analysis. The science behind why this worked was simple: resource optimization. By immediately eliminating prisoners who consumed resources without providing value, Vikings could maintain their mobility and fighting effectiveness while maximizing the return on their raids. A ship that might have been slowed down by 50 captives could move quickly, with 20 carefully selected prisoners who actually helped with rowing and camp duties. But Vikings quickly discovered limitations to this system. The biggest problem: information. Then, there's something even more surprising about how Vikings solved their intelligence problem. Interrogation in the Viking Age wasn't the crude torture session most people imagine. Smart Vikings learned that dead prisoners tell no tales, and tortured prisoners often lie to stop the pain. They needed reliable intelligence about enemy movements, hidden treasures, local politics, and future raid targets. The problem was extracting accurate information from people who had every reason to lie, misdirect, or simply refuse to cooperate. Early attempts involved standard medieval torture, heated metal, breaking bones, creative uses of sharp objects. But Vikings discovered what modern interrogators know: torture produces unreliable intelligence. Bad choice when you need accurate information about which neighboring village stores their grain, or which nobleman is traveling with minimal guards. The breakthrough came through psychological manipulation and what we'd now recognize as good cop, bad cop routines, but with a uniquely Viking twist. They developed what sagas refer to as the choice of deaths. Here's how it worked. High-value prisoners were presented with multiple execution options, each described in vivid detail. The blood eagle, having your ribs separated from your spine while alive, hanging from the world tree until Odin claimed you. drowning in bogs as sacrifice to water spirits, burning alive in longhouses as offerings to fire gods. But then came the alternative: complete cooperation in exchange for a clean death, or even potential freedom through thraldom. The choice wasn't really between life and death. It was between horrible death and tolerable death, with a slim chance of survival. And the weird part is, modern psychological research confirms this approach works better than pure torture because it gives subjects a sense of agency in their fate, making them more likely to cooperate genuinely rather than just saying whatever they think their captors want to hear. The system had obvious limitations. Prisoners could still lie, misdirect, or provide outdated information. Some captives, particularly Christian clergy, seemed to welcome martyrdom and refused to cooperate regardless of threats. Others were simply too traumatized or ignorant to provide useful intelligence. Then there's something even more disturbing about how Vikings weaponized their captives for psychological warfare. The problem Vikings faced wasn't just extracting information, it was spreading fear. A successful raid might net you slaves and treasure, but if word didn't spread about your capabilities, you'd have to fight the same battles over and over. Vikings needed their reputation to do half the work for them. Early attempts at intimidation were straightforward. Leave behind mutilated bodies, burn everything, make lots of noise during attacks. Effective locally, but news traveled slowly in medieval Europe, and stories got distorted or dismissed as exaggerations. The breakthrough was realizing that returned captives were the perfect vector for psychological warfare. Not dead captives, living ones who had witnessed Viking capabilities and lived to tell about it. Vikings began deliberately releasing certain prisoners, but only after ensuring they had witnessed specific horrors designed to spread fear. These weren't accidental survivors. They were carefully chosen psychological weapons. Picture this. You're a farmer in a Saxon village. A neighboring settlement was raided 3 months ago. Most people were killed or taken as slaves, but a few survivors trickled back over the following weeks. They tell consistent stories about Viking organization, their numbers, their weapons, their casual efficiency in killing. More importantly, they describe the fates of specific individuals everyone knew. The local blacksmith tortured for information about iron stores. The priest forced to watch his monastery burn before being executed. Children selected for slavery based on age and health. These returned captives became unwitting Viking recruiters, spreading detailed intelligence about Viking capabilities while demoralizing potential resistance. It's psychological warfare through human proxies, and the weird part is, this tactic appears in modern military doctrine as demonstration of capability, deliberately allowing enemy witnesses to observe your forces in action to deter future resistance without having to actually deploy those forces repeatedly. The science behind this approach was rooted in medieval communication networks. In a world without mass media, personal testimony from trusted community members was the most reliable form of information transfer. A returned captive wasn't just telling a story. They were providing eyewitness testimony about Viking capabilities, methods, and intentions. But Vikings discovered limitations here too. Some returned captives, particularly those with strong religious convictions, actually used their survival to rally resistance rather than spread fear. Christian communities sometimes interpreted survival as divine intervention, making survivors into local heroes rather than harbingers of doom. Then there's something even more calculated about how Vikings used ritualistic execution for political messaging. Religious sacrifice in Viking culture wasn't random bloodlust. It was carefully choreographed political theatre designed to communicate specific messages to multiple audiences simultaneously. The most famous example, the blood eagle, wasn't just about causing maximum pain. It was about demonstrating Viking religious devotion, political dominance, and cultural superiority all in one gruesome performance. The problem was that standard execution, while efficient, didn't carry sufficient political weight. Killing an enemy chief with a sword thrust might eliminate a rival, but it didn't establish cultural dominance or religious authority. Vikings needed executions that would be remembered, discussed, and feared for generations. The first attempts involved adapting existing Scandinavian religious practices to new political contexts. Traditional blots, sacrificial ceremonies, were expanded to include prominent captives, but early versions were often poorly executed, literally and figuratively, too private to spread fear, too public to maintain religious mystery, too rushed to build appropriate drama. The breakthrough came through treating execution as performance art with multiple target audiences. The actual captive was almost secondary. The real audience was the Viking warriors, who needed to see their leaders honoring the gods, local populations, who needed to understand the futility of resistance, distant enemies, who would hear detailed accounts, and the gods themselves, who required proper ritual observance. Consider the execution of King Ella of Northumbria in 867 CE, as described in later sagas. The blood eagle wasn't performed in the heat of battle or immediately after capture. It was scheduled, planned, and executed as a public ceremony with specific religious and political objectives. Viking jarls invited local nobles to witness the execution, forcing them to watch their former king tortured to death as religious sacrifice. The message was clear: this is what happens to kings who resist us, and your gods cannot protect you from ours. And the weird part is, modern political scientists recognize this as sophisticated demonstration diplomacy, using spectacular public events to communicate political messages to multiple audiences simultaneously, a technique still used by modern authoritarian regimes. The science behind ritual execution was psychological and political. By framing murder as religious duty, Vikings transformed acts of revenge into sacred obligations. This removed personal responsibility from individual warriors, while elevating the jarl's authority as religious leader. Simultaneously, the elaborate, time-consuming nature of ritual execution demonstrated Viking confidence. They were so secure in their dominance that they could afford to spend hours killing single individuals rather than rushing to defend against counterattacks. But Vikings learned that ritual execution had significant limitations. It required substantial resources, time, personnel, and materials for proper ceremony. It could backfire if the victim demonstrated exceptional courage, or if witnesses interpreted the death as martyrdom rather than defeat. Most critically, it only worked if news of the execution spread to appropriate audiences, which wasn't guaranteed in medieval communication networks. Then there's something even more economically sophisticated about how Vikings developed slave trading networks that spanned continents. When standard raiding and local slave markets weren't cutting it, Vikings developed what can only be described as the medieval world's most sophisticated human trafficking network, connecting Scandinavia to slave markets from Dublin to Constantinople. The advanced technique that separated professional Viking slave traders from amateur raiders was route optimization combined with human commodity specialization. Instead of simply grabbing whoever they could catch and selling them to the nearest market, sophisticated Viking operations began conducting market research across Europe and beyond. Here's how it worked. Scandinavian traders established permanent representatives in major slave markets throughout the known world. These weren't just buyers and sellers. They were market analysts who tracked supply, demand, and pricing for different types of human commodities. A representative in Dublin might send word north that Irish monasteries were paying premium prices for literate slaves who could serve as scribes. Meanwhile, a trader in Constantinople reported high demand for fair-haired women for Byzantine harems, while Bulgar merchants along the Volga River sought strong young men for agricultural work. Vikings began tailoring their raids to match market demand. Rather than random violence, they conducted targeted human harvesting operations designed to capture specific demographic groups for specific markets. The saga of the Greenlanders describes raiders who spent weeks observing potential targets before attacking, noting the ages, apparent skills, and physical characteristics of inhabitants to determine whether a raid would be profitable. Talk about supply chain management before anyone knew what a supply chain was. The rapid-fire success of this system created problems traditional Viking culture wasn't equipped to handle. Successful slave traders were accumulating wealth that exceeded traditional jarls, disrupting established social hierarchies. Young warriors who showed aptitude for human commodities trading could become rich faster than veteran fighters, creating tension within traditional warrior culture. But the most successful operations solved this through partnership structures that combined traditional Viking warrior culture with emerging merchant capabilities. Experienced fighters provided military expertise and cultural credibility, while specialized traders handled market analysis, route planning, and commodity assessment. These partnerships could mount expeditions that were simultaneously military campaigns, trading ventures, and religious obligations. The failure rate for amateur operations remained high. Vikings who treated slave trading like extended raiding expeditions frequently lost money, got caught in foreign territories without local support, or misread market conditions and found themselves stuck with human cargo they couldn't sell profitably. The Dublin slave market records from the 9th century show evidence of Viking traders who arrived with captives only to discover their merchandise was worthless in local markets. Advanced practitioners developed quality control systems that seemed disturbingly modern. Captives were evaluated not just for immediate utility, but for market potential months in the future. Young children were assessed for growth potential and training possibilities. Adults were evaluated for existing skills, learning capability, and psychological resilience. Even elderly captives weren't automatically discarded. Some had valuable knowledge or could serve specialized functions in certain markets. The most sophisticated operations employed what we'd now recognize as human resources professionals, specialists who could assess captive potential, predict market demand, and optimize transportation logistics. These individuals often weren't warriors at all, but former thralls who had earned freedom through demonstrating expertise in human commodity evaluation. And here's where it gets really disturbing. Vikings began breeding programs for human captives, treating them like livestock with genetic selection for desirable traits. Archaeological evidence from Iceland and Greenland suggests that some Viking settlements maintained multi-generational slave populations specifically bred for export to foreign markets. Fair hair, blue eyes, and tall stature were actively selected for because they commanded premium prices in Mediterranean markets. The transportation innovations were equally impressive and horrifying. Standard longships were modified with specialized slave holds that maximized human cargo capacity while maintaining seaworthiness. These modifications included improved ventilation systems, waste management solutions, and feeding logistics designed to keep human cargo alive and relatively healthy during voyages that could last months. Advanced Viking operations also developed what modern economists would recognize as futures contracts and credit systems. Traders would arrive at markets with documentation describing captives still in transport, allowing buyers to purchase slaves before they physically arrived. This system reduced transportation costs and storage expenses while providing capital for financing additional raids. The most successful Viking slave trading operations eventually evolved beyond simple raiding. They established what were essentially human ranching operations, permanent settlements in conquered territories where local populations were maintained as renewable sources of slave labor. Rather than depleting regions through excessive raiding, these operations managed human populations like sustainable resources, taking only enough captives to maintain long-term productivity. But even these sophisticated systems had limitations. They required substantial capital investment, extensive international contacts, and political stability across multiple regions. Economic disruptions, military defeats, or changes in foreign market conditions could destroy operations that had taken decades to establish. The system was also vulnerable to competition from other cultures developing their own slave trading capabilities, gradually reducing Viking advantages in human commodity markets. The brutal reality of what Vikings did to captured enemies reveals something far more complex and disturbing than simple barbarism. These were sophisticated strategic thinkers who transformed human suffering into a precise instrument of economic, political, and religious power that shaped medieval European development for centuries. Their innovations in human resource management, psychological warfare, international trading networks, and commodity optimization weren't accidents or byproducts of raiding culture. They were deliberate developments by cultures that recognized human beings as renewable resources to be harvested, processed, and distributed according to market demand and strategic objectives. The archaeological evidence from sites across the former Viking world tells a story of systematic, calculated, and horrifyingly efficient human exploitation that operated on scales not seen again until the Atlantic slave trade centuries later. When we find mass graves with evidence of selection-based execution, when we uncover modified longships designed for human cargo transport, when we trace Viking trade routes that connected Scandinavian raid sites to slave markets spanning 3 continents, we're not looking at mindless violence. We're looking at the medieval world's most successful human trafficking operation. The modern legacy of Viking prisoner management extends far beyond historical curiosity. Their psychological warfare techniques influenced medieval military doctrine across Europe. Their market-based approach to human commodification prefigured later colonial exploitation systems. Their integration of religious obligation with economic exploitation became a template that would be repeatedly applied by expanding civilizations. But perhaps most disturbingly, their systematic approach to dehumanizing captives, sorting them by utility, treating them as renewable resources, optimizing their exploitation for maximum benefit, established patterns of institutional cruelty that echo through subsequent centuries of human history. The sagas that celebrate Viking achievements rarely mention the millions of human lives consumed by their success. The archaeological record preserves evidence of their sophisticated brutality, but the individual stories of their victims remain largely silent. When we admire Viking craftsmanship, exploration, or cultural achievements, we're looking at civilizations built literally on the bones of enslaved populations, whose suffering enabled Scandinavian expansion. Understanding what Vikings really did to captured enemies isn't just historical education. It's a reminder of humanity's capacity for transforming cruelty into systematic efficiency, for treating other human beings as commodities, and for building impressive civilizations on foundations of unimaginable suffering. The most successful Vikings weren't just good at fighting. They were good at turning human misery into sustainable competitive advantages that lasted for generations, leaving behind cultural legacies that we celebrate today, while forgetting the uncounted dead who paid for Viking greatness with their lives, their freedom, and their dignity. Makes you wonder what other great civilizations we admire without fully understanding the human cost of their achievements.